Hi, this is Jeremy, and this lecture is about productive brainstorming. It is critically important to take time to brainstorm before you start building. You want to make sure that when you start working on an idea, it's an idea that you're passionate about, that you can't wait to get built, and that you're really able to finish in the time allotted. And so you want to give yourself every opportunity to land on that kind of idea. And what we're going to talk about today is a process that can maximize the probability that you put out your full creativity and explore the possibility space of ideas that could ultimately become your app or game this summer. We're going to go over some principles and then actually put them to practice through 2 exercises. First, I'd like to acknowledge our goals. We all want something that is finished and on the App Store. We say it many times, and we'll say it again. The worst app that makes the App Store will get more downloads than the best one that doesn't. We want our games to be fun and our apps to be useful. And we also want to create something that is so compelling that it gets people to spend time out of their day to share it with their friends. And that's what we call remarkable. We also have some constraints to work with. What is the platform that we're developing for? It's very important to note that, for example, console games and desktop apps are very different beasts from mobile games and apps. How much time will a particular idea take to create is important to think about. And we need some way in our process to weed out ideas that ultimately aren't feasible to complete in the time allotted. And finally, we need to be thinking about onboarding. Onboarding is a term that describes the process a user goes through to learn how to use an app or game. And because your users are going to be halfway across the world, it's important to understand that you're not going to be there physically, and that for the idea that you choose, you need to have a corresponding plan to get users to understand how to interact with it without another human present. So we've acknowledged our goals and we've acknowledged our constraints, but I'd like us to put these aside for just a second as we start at the very beginning of the process. And the process we're going to go through is one where we brainstorm, then refine, then build. The first step is open brainstorming, a process designed to generate as many ideas as possible, viable or not. When you go through brainstorming, and we're going to do it in groups, it's important to not criticize the ideas of others, only build upon them. At some point, it will be incredibly valuable to get the feedback of your peers, but this is not a point to constrain the process, it's a point to expand the process. And what that means is you're not going to be telling others whether their ideas are silly or not feasible. You're going to hold your tongue, and if you're going to say anything, it's going to be to contribute more ideas or build on top of ideas. We also don't want people apologizing for their ideas. It is very natural and human to start by saying something like, well, I haven't thought about this, or this is probably really dumb, or you're all going to laugh, but... And we'd like to try to cut these things out of our language. Finally, brainstorming does go towards a goal. You're going to have a prompt or a topic that you're brainstorming around, and it is important to try to stay on topic and to take the process seriously. Just because we're telling you not to censor yourselves and not to censor others does not mean that it's appropriate to come up with silly, off-topic, rude, or offensive ideas. So please use your best judgment and take this seriously. Now I'd like you to split into groups of 4. You can pause this video until you've done so. We're going to start with an open brainstorm around a specific prompt. What would you use or play if it was on the App Store tomorrow? This is very broad and general, but I don't want you to constrain yourself or self-censor because you're worried about whether you're coming up with ideas that are feasible to build, feasible to complete, or that will have large user bases. Ideas that don't fit any of these criteria might be one variation or permutation away from your winning idea. And so this is the time to be as open and creative as possible without worrying too much about the feasibility of anything you're suggesting. So I'd like your group to take time for 5 minutes to brainstorm around this topic. And you can pause this video until you're done. The next part of this exercise is to try one of the many ways that you can expand your list of ideas. Here what we're going to do is look at our list of ideas and imagine what a parody version of those ideas would look like. This is just an excuse to start thinking about variations, about expansions and contractions and extremes of our ideas, to generate a new list of ideas from which we can then pick what we're actually going to work on. I'd like you to take 5 more minutes with your group to go over your original list and generate a new one based on this variation. You can pause this video until you're done. Now we're at the point where we'd like to go through and refine our ideas. Remember, this is just an exercise. Do not worry if you don't feel like you've landed on that perfect idea. This is not the last time we're brainstorming. It would be silly to only brainstorm for a total of 10 minutes towards an idea that you're going to spend more than 6 weeks full-time building. But we're going to go through the motions now to start practicing some of the processes that you're going to want to use independently when eventually coming up with your app idea. So how do we refine? First, we have to think about ideas that are feasible given the constraints. So now is a good time to kind of strike ideas that you think you can complete in the next 6 to 7 weeks, ideas that you can't figure out how to teach users how to use, or ideas that you think would not get that large target audiences. But remember, it is useful to have 1,000 passionate users. I would argue more so than 100,000 people who only open your app once. So please take 5 minutes to go ahead and refine your idea list with your group. Now let's recap the exercise. Each member of each group gets to pick their favorite idea and read it out loud to everyone. If 2 people in the group pick the same idea, that's fine. Pick someone to read it once. The goal here is to go from group to group and pitch your best ideas. We haven't gone over how to pitch yet, so in the back of your minds, think about ways that you could more clearly explain what your peers are pitching. And later, we'll go over how to carefully construct a pitch and quickly summarize an app or game idea. For now, you're going to have to wing it. Go ahead and go around and read your app ideas, read your game ideas, pause the video, and restart it when you're done. Now we're going to get into a more interactive exercise. The purpose here is to shift context. Think away from your goals this summer and simply apply the process and practice it towards a different goal. We're going to give you materials that allow you to spend the rest of the day designing a board game. And then you're going to teach it to others. It's going to be tons of fun. So what are your constraints here? You're going to make the game run on a 5x5 or 10x10 grid. That means you should actually trace it out with a ruler on a sheet of paper. The game is going to be single player and turn-based, meaning the player makes a decision, sees the outcome of their decision, and then can make another. Speed or reflexes should not matter for this game. Finally, and most interestingly, the team that creates the game is going to act like the computer. So when you design a game, you're going to teach it to someone that is not on your team. They're going to take an action in your game, and then you as the computer are going to take an action. Then they will take an action, and so on and so forth. The important thing is the player you teach the game to should have choice. There should be some strategy, and they're going to try to win your game. You as the computer will not have choice. What this means is you need to design rules such that the computer's actions are predictable. They don't have to be visible to the player. The player does not have to know how the computer will react, but the computer needs to react in a way that is defined by your rules and not by a human. For example, you might write actions the computer could take on cards, and then every turn after the player moves, you draw a card to see what the computer would do. So to recap, the game takes place in a 5x5 or 10x10 grid. You can use the materials we have provided for you. The game is going to be single player. Someone who is not on your team is going to have to learn how to play it. The game is going to be turn-based. And every time after the player takes an action, you, as the creators of the game, are going to act as the computer and take an action yourselves. So let's make this game. Some things to think about as you go through these 4 phases. When brainstorming, don't self-censor and don't censor others. Build upon ideas, don't shoot them down. You may consider stopping 5 minutes in to add a different dimension, like saying, take all the ideas we already have and let's look at what a fantasy version, or a fast-paced version, or a parody version, or a controversial version of these ideas would look like. Don't worry about the constraints yet. Don't rule out ideas that wouldn't work on a 5x5 or 10x10 grid. Don't rule out ideas that cannot be created with the materials present, because these ideas may inspire others that do conform to the constraints. Then, during the 5-minute refinement phase, you're going to want to rule out ideas that don't conform to the constraints. Go for it. Rule out things that you can't build in time. Rule out things that are too hard to teach. Rule out things that you don't have the materials to build. Then take 15 minutes to actually create the game, tracing it out, correcting your ideas as you move along. You'll encounter things that didn't work as well as you thought, and I encourage you, as you're building it, to start playing it amongst yourselves. You really need to play it to understand whether it truly works. After this phase, when you're making the rules, Think hard about how another player is going to be able to understand how to play your game. What is the best way to communicate the goals, overarchingly, the goals each turn, and what a player can or cannot do. This is a lot to figure out, and honestly, historically, it's a mess, and that's fine. The point of this exercise is to start to get you thinking about how hard it is to design something that others can understand. And the core thing I want you to think about here is that if someone is not able to understand how to play your game, you should treat it as you're failing, not theirs. Now is the time to start adopting the mentality that there are no stupid users, only poorly designed products. And without sounding too harsh, you are going to design something in 15 minutes and then make rules for it in 10. It cannot be polished. It cannot be perfect. And do the best you can while staying humble and not getting too frustrated. It's really going to be difficult to get this done at the time allotted. And then when you start teaching it to others, it's going to be a big challenge. But hopefully it gives you some sense to start thinking about what you're going to face when you start making your own app or game. After we build the games, we're going to play the games. You're going to match up with another team of 4, and you're going to explain the rules to them. You're only going to have 5 minutes, and the instructors are going to set a timer. Once you're done explaining the rules, they're going to designate one person who's going to play the game. And critically, as soon as they start playing, your whole team must stay silent. It is going to be human nature to want to interject, because almost certainly you're going to have forgotten to explain some rule, or they're going to do something wrong because they weren't paying attention, and you're going to want to jump in and correct them. Similarly, it's going to be in their human nature to ask you questions. They're going to try to do something and then turn to you and say, "Hey, am I allowed to do this?" You have to stay silent. The point of staying silent is to observe just how difficult it is for a user to understand how to use something that they've never seen before. And I guarantee you that the majority of you will underestimate just how terribly new users do at deciphering how to use a new product. So, 5 minutes to explain, you can talk freely, and then 10 minutes when the other team is going to try to play it. One of their players is the one actually playing. The rest of the team can talk to that one player, but the two teams cannot talk to each other. All you can do is play as the computer if you're the designer of the game. And watch and learn. So let's start making a board game. You can pause this video to keep this slide up, and I'd like everyone to start brainstorming now. You can unpause when you've finished making the rules. And I'd like to ask the instructors to keep time for each phase and clearly call 2-minute and 1-minute warnings. Great. You've hopefully made a game. You've hopefully made rules for it. Now it's time to explain to another team how to play. Instructors, please help the teams of 4 find another team to match up with and play with, and then set a timer to give them 5 minutes to explain the rules. Give them 2-minute and 1-minute warnings, and then once they switch to playing the game, strictly enforce silence, unless players have completely given up or they try to do an illegal move. Have fun!